Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 13th Annual Sexuality, Integrity, and the University Conference. My name is Dr. Jennifer Frey, and I'm going to be your host this evening and also tomorrow afternoon. Also, thank you for your patience as we dealt with some technical difficulties on our end. This year's conference has been made possible by numerous sponsors, including the Wheatley Institution at Brigham Young University, the Pontifical John Paul II Institute at the Catholic University of America, the Christian Union, the Heritage Foundation, advancing the principles of free enterprise, limited government, individual freedom, traditional American values, and a strong national defense, and the Leadership Institute, helping young conservatives maintain strong voices on their college campuses. We are grateful for their support in making this virtual event possible and helping us reach many more students and supporters. I'd also like to thank all students attending this weekend's conference. Please know that the Love Ability Network stands behind you in all that you do. Your openness, your leadership, and your examples give light to us, your peers, and the institutions you attend. I'd also like to thank the Love and Fidelity Network's generous supporters. Your contributions allow our students to form groups, host speakers, events, and activities that expand their intellectual horizons and preserve spaces for friendship and conversations on campuses across the country. So I want to say something to start us off about who I am and why I am here with you this evening. So I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of South Carolina, and most of my work centers around concepts of virtue and human flourishing. And one of the deepest influences on my own work in these areas has been a philosopher named Elizabeth Anscombe. You may have heard of Anscombe on account of the Anscombe Society at Princeton University. So I'd like to start off by saying who Anscombe was and why she was important to my work specifically, and also, of course, the sort of work that we're trying to do with this conference. So Elizabeth Anscombe was born on March 18, 1919 in Limerick, Ireland. In 1937, she entered Oxford, where she studied Mods and Greats at St. Hugh's College. Now, during her first year at Oxford, she studied Aquinas at Blackfriars Hall, and that same year she was formally received into the Catholic Church. In 1938, Anscombe met another philosopher and convert, Peter Geach. They married in 1941, just after she finished her degree. The following year, she was awarded a research fellowship at Newnham College, Cambridge, where she stayed until 1945. It was during this time that she met and attended the lectures of the world-renowned philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who became her close friend and philosophical interlocutor. Although Wittgenstein was known for having a low regard for women, he was deeply impressed by, admired, and trusted Elizabeth Anscombe. He affectionately addressed her as old man. His trust in her own philosophical acumen was so deep that he appointed her his literary executor and charged her with the task of translating his most important work. Anscombe's translation of Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations has, of course, become a modern classic. In 1970, Anscombe was appointed to the prestigious chair that Wittgenstein held at Cambridge, a position that she maintained until her retirement from teaching in 1986. She also held visiting appointments all over the world. Anscombe died on January 5th in 2001, and she is buried next to her teacher, Wittgenstein. Anscombe's philosophical achievements are widely recognized. She made significant contributions in every area of philosophy. She also wrote many philosophical essays on a wide range of topics relating to Catholic teaching. Her essay, Modern Moral Philosophy, is still widely acknowledged as one of the most influential works of 20th century philosophy. It sparked a renewed and sustained interest in the concepts of practical reason, virtue, and human flourishing, concepts that I think are central to a proper account of ethics, yet have been neglected by modern moral philosophers for centuries, and I think are still neglected today. Now, although Anscombe lived an intellectual life, she did not shy away from political concerns. In 1935, when she was an undergraduate at Oxford, she published a pamphlet protesting British rhetoric leading up to its involvement in World War II. The pamphlet denounced the doctrine of the indivisibility of modern warfare because it recognized no principled distinction between civilians and enemy combatants. In it, she argues on just war grounds that we must maintain the distinction between innocents and non-innocents in war. For without this distinction, we can no longer hold fast to absolute or exceptionless prohibitions against the killing of innocent persons, or murder. 7 years later, as a faculty member, Anscombe opposed Oxford's move to award President Harry S. Truman an honorary degree. Anscombe argued that Truman, as the man responsible for the decision to drop atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was a mass murderer. So her argument that Truman was unworthy of honors rests on her analysis of what we must say he intended as a means to his ends in giving the order to drop weapons of mass destruction on civilian populations. In the bombing of these cities, she argued, it was certainly decided to kill the innocent as a means to an end, and this is always a description of murder. Anscombe wondered why so many Oxford dons would be happy to flatter a mass murderer, but she thought the following consideration would shed some light on the subject. All the prevailing moral philosophies put forward at Oxford since the turn of the century reject the idea that any actions such as murder, adultery, fornication, or the judicial condemnation of the innocent are absolutely forbidden. In her famous essay, Modern Moral Philosophy, Anscombe argued that it is the shared commitment to what she called consequentialism that explains this fact. Now, as Anscombe famously defined it, a moral philosophy is consequentialist if it denies the importance of the distinction between intention and foresight. According to the consequentialist, it just doesn't make any difference to a man's responsibility for an effect of his action which he can foresee if he does not intend it. If there is no such difference, Anscombe argues, then all we can do is weigh up the consequences of one's action and choose that action that'll bring about the best results. Absolute prohibitions would no longer make any sense. And she notes that the arguments in defense of Truman's actions were all consequentialist. Anscombe wrote several philosophies in defense of Catholic teaching on the nature and purpose of human sexuality, right at the time that the world began to vociferously denounce it. These arguments are formally indistinguishable from her arguments against Harry Truman. Both of them rest on the idea that there are certain types of actions that are just incompatible with specific virtues. So we cannot have intentionally infertile sex while maintaining chastity, she argues, and likewise, we cannot intentionally murder civilians while maintaining justice. Anscombe's commitment to church teaching about the virtue of chastity was not, of course, merely intellectual. Anscombe was the mother of 7 children. And Anscombe's defense of traditional sexual ethics certainly put her on the outs with the dons at Oxford and made her the subject of scathing attack. Now, in addition to facing open contempt and scorn, Anscombe was willing to be arrested for her convictions, and she was not averse to public protest. She was arrested twice at abortion clinics in her advanced age. Although her conservative fans tend to downplay her public opposition to World War II, to Truman, the Vietnam War, and nuclear arms, her progressive fans are equally embarrassed by her commitments to the inviolable dignity or worth of each human person at every stage of human life, and also, of course, traditional ideals of marriage and chastity. Certainly, it would be very difficult to characterize her in terms of our contemporary political categories, precisely because her thought and reasoning simply did not bend themselves to conform to the goals of any political party or agenda. She was very much her own woman. Although Anscombe was a devout and committed Catholic, many of her friends and closest collaborators were not, and they disagreed with her about matters of grave ethical import, including, of course, her views on human sexuality. But what allowed Anscombe to enter into these relationships was her desire to know, which led her into deep friendships with others who shared it. And what her students and friends seemed to admire in her was not only her manifest brilliance, but also, and most importantly, her dogged and unflinching insistence upon the truth, no matter how inconvenient or unpopular it might be. And finally, Anscombe did not accept the sort of conventional gender norms placed on her time. She was averse to dresses or preferred pants, going so far as to remove her pants when told that women could not wear them to a restaurant she had been taken to by her hosts. She did not take her husband's name. She did not stay home with the children, and she was content to leave them in the care of others while she attended to her own work. She was definitely not known for being nice or deferential or well-kept or maintaining a decorous home. And yet, she took on the roles of her gender when she thought they were not superficial, but important and deep. She was a faithful wife and mother who oversaw hospitality to others. And of course, she took the education of her children very seriously. She did not seem to identify as a feminist, nor can one find feminist principles in her philosophy. So whatever she made of equality of the sexes, it could not come at the price of the truths of morality and what she took to be the unique responsibilities of womanhood, which she bore without complaint or fanfare. So I hope it's clear why I think Anscombe is an appropriate model of reflection and insight for us this evening. Anscombe not only argued for the truths about the human person that we will be exploring, but she lived them. And she reminds us that the moral life is really about seeking human flourishing, and that certain ordinary virtues are necessary for this. And I think her own life was certainly very full and complete in this respect. Okay, so before we head into the conference proper, we'd like to recognize one of our weekend sponsors, the Wheatley Institution. The Wheatley Institution at Brigham Young University believes the civility, dignity, and equity put at risk in our current social crises can be restored by rebuilding authentic confidence in the core institutions of civil society, beginning with the family. The Wheatley Institution supports and defends the formative work of families, congregations, and communities through practical research-based thought leadership and training. If you're interested in learning more, visit wheatley.byu.edu. Now, in just a few moments, I'm going to start asking Tyler your questions from chat boxes live. And I'll explain more about how we will select those questions after Tyler's presentation. But for now, make sure that you hit the like or subscribe button, and then start dropping your questions in the chat on Facebook and YouTube. We will have a limited amount of time, so please choose your questions carefully. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker this evening, Dr. Tyler VanderWeele. Tyler J. VanderWeele is the John L. Loeb and Francis Lehman Loeb Professor of Epidemiology in the Departments of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and also Director of the Human Flourishing Program and co-director of the Initiative on Health, Religion, and Spirituality at Harvard University. He holds degrees from the University of Oxford, the University of Pennsylvania, and Harvard University in mathematics, philosophy, theology, finance, and biostatistics. His empirical research spans psychiatric and social epidemiology, the science of happiness and flourishing, and the study of religion and health. He has published over 300 papers in peer-reviewed journals and is the author of the books Explanation and Causal Inference and Measuring Well-Being. Tyler, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and it is a pleasure being with you all this evening. I was asked by the Love and Fidelity Network to talk about the science of human flourishing and to discuss some of our research at Harvard at the Human Flourishing Program. And that is indeed what I will be doing this evening, but I would like to do so with a particular emphasis on human relationships, on family, on love and fidelity. And so I'll briefly discuss what it is that we might mean by human flourishing, our own efforts to try to form at least a very crude assessment of flourishing for the purposes of empirical research. But then I'll also talk about activities that one can participate in and communities that one can actively join in order to enhance one's flourishing and also that of others. And I will conclude with some remarks on the importance of families for flourishing. More information on the work that we're doing is available at the Human Flourishing Program website. and as well as in a couple of these papers on promotion of human flourishing in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and a recent paper on some of these activities for flourishing that I will be discussing later in this evening's presentation. So what might we mean by flourishing? Well, if we turn to our academic disciplines, we often see very grand visions of human flourishing present. So the World Health Organization's definition of health from 1948, still in place today, is that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Economics is sometimes conceived of as an attempt to study how agents maximize their expected utility, supposedly taking into account all aspects of the agent's preferences. The discipline of positive psychology has sometimes been defined as the scientific study of the strengths that enable individuals and communities to thrive. But in practice, in our discussions and our actual studies, often these are restricted to very specific disease states in health, or very simple measures of positive affect or happiness within psychology, or simply measures of income within economics. So if we want to return to a broader vision of flourishing and to think about how we might go about studying and even assessing it, we need to give further thought to this concept of flourishing and to what reasonable assessment approaches might be. So if we turn to our dictionaries, the Oxford English Dictionary defines to flourish as to grow or develop in a healthy or vigorous way. The American Heritage Dictionary, to do or fare well. The etymology of the term comes from Latin, florere, to bloom, blossom, or flower. It's all the word that's sometimes used to translate Aristotle's eudaimonia, sometimes also translated as happiness. The definition, working definition that we've been using at the Human Flourishing program at Harvard has been that flourishing or complete human well-being is living in a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good. This is arguably what we're after as individuals and ought to be after as a society. But with a definition so broad and expansive, we might ask the question, how could we possibly ever go about assessing such a thing? There have been numerous measures of well-being put forward in the positive psychology literature, and I think this is the discipline that, from an empirical perspective, has come closest to trying to study what it is that we might mean by flourishing. But notably absent from the very many measures that have appeared in the positive psychology literature are health. And are we really flourishing if we're not healthy, if we're physically ill, if we're bedridden? Also often missing from these measures are any notion of virtue or character. Contrary to Plato, Aristotle, the vast majority of the Western philosophical and theological traditions, and really philosophical and religious traditions worldwide. So these measures that we do have, while of some value, are missing some of the important aspects of well-being or flourishing. But with a conception so broad and a concept that's so rich, we might wonder, is it ever possible to achieve any consensus? Is it ever possible to go about measuring such a thing? And I certainly believe that conceptions, any adequate conception of flourishing, really is going to differ across philosophical or religious or cultural traditions. I think there are real disagreements and discussions, and important ones, over what really constitutes the good life, what constitutes flourishing, what constitutes living well. So what we've tried to do in our own assessment work is to focus on aspects of human life that seem common to most of these traditions. And so what I would propose is that there are at least 5 domains of human life that any reasonable conception of flourishing would include. Not that we can reduce flourishing to these 5 domains, and any reasonable conception of flourishing would indeed be much richer, but that for any reasonable conception of flourishing, whatever else it might include, it would include these 5 as well. And these are happiness and life satisfaction, physical and mental health, meaning and purpose, character and close social relationships. Again, the argument is not that these things exhaust what we mean by flourishing, but each is probably a part of it. I think each of these domains also satisfies the following two criteria. Each is nearly universally desired. And we have empirical data on this now as well. And each also constitutes its own end. It's sought for its own sake. It's not merely a means to achieve other ends. And I think these two criteria, being an end and being nearly universally desired, might help shape consensus around what to measure. And so as a very crude measure of human flourishing, we've proposed two questions drawn principally from the existing well-being literature in each of these 5 domains. And I'll briefly run through what these are so that you can have a sense as to the sorts of questions that are guiding some of the empirical work I'll be describing later on. In the happiness and life satisfaction domain, we have first more of a cognitive, evaluative question. How satisfied are you with life as a whole these days? 0, not at all satisfied. 10, completely satisfied. And these are all self-rated. And then something more effective. In general, how happy or unhappy do you usually feel? Again, scored 0 to 10. Then with physical mental health, we've chosen 2 questions from numerous surveys from the World Health Organization, the US General Social Survey. For physical health in general, how would you rate your physical health? Or for mental health, how would you rate your overall mental health? Again, widely used questions. In the meaning and purpose domain, one on one's activities, overall, to what extent do you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile? And this is, in fact, one of the most widely used well-being questions in the empirical literature. But then second, also some cognitive. I understand my purpose in life. 0, completely disagree. 10, completely agree. The character and virtue domain was the one domain where these questions were newly proposed and developed in collaboration with philosophers, but also simplified and refined through cognitive testing. And essentially, these are drawing upon notions of the cardinal virtues that at the foundation of all moral virtues lie 4: practical wisdom or prudence, justice, fortitude or courage, and temperance or moderation. And the first question is very, very crudely trying to, in some way, assess justice and practical wisdom. I always act to promote good in all circumstances, even in difficult and challenging situations. 0, not at all true of me. 10, completely true of me. And then second, I'm always able to give up some happiness now for a greater happiness later, intended, again, in some very crude way to try to get at notions of fortitude and temperance. And then finally, in the 5th domain, for social relationships, I am content with my friendships and relationships, essentially trying to assess the quantity or extent of those relationships. And then second, my relationships are as satisfying as I would like them to be, trying to assess the quality of those relationships. And these were drawn from the UK's Campaign to End Loneliness survey of measures as being particularly suitable for short assessments. So we could go on to the next slide. When we use these questions, we typically look at each of the domains separately, but we will occasionally average over the questions as a very crude measure, though really it should be conceived as nothing more than the average of these 5 more meaningful domains to give a score of 0 to 10, to try to understand what is it in human life that can shape and promote flourishing. In our work, we also typically supplement these 10 questions with 2 additional on financial and material stability. While these really are means rather than ends, we think these questions are important in assessing whether flourishing is going to be likely sustained over longer periods of time. And these questions were drawn from the financial well-being literature. First, how often do you worry about being able to meet normal monthly living expenses? And then second, how often do you worry about safety, food, and housing? 0, worry all the time. 10, do not worry at all. And we'll average all 12 of these questions to to form kind of a more secure measure of flourishing, probably less satisfactory conceptually, because each of these is really a means rather than an end, but perhaps helpful in practice to assess whether flourishing is likely to be sustained over time. And we've been using this work for research, which I will be describing shortly. But I think these questions are also helpful in the lives of individuals and of institutions. I think they can provide an opportunity for self-reflection, for self-assessment, for trying to assess what is going well in life and what is not, for trying to identify areas of improvement or changes that one wants to make in life, or at both the individual and at the institutional level for tracking well-being over time, to try to discern what's improving and what is not. And so with that, I am in fact going to take a very short break, if we go back 2 slides, and allow you to reflect on your own life, to go through these questions here, to think about your life, to think about what is going well and what might not be going well. So we'll spend about 2 minutes for each of you to reflect on these questions, and then we'll move on to talk about how these assessments can be useful in discerning how to promote flourishing. So I realize this is a little bit more awkward online than it would be in person, but I do think sometime a pause for reflection at this point might indeed be valuable. So I'll give you all 2 minutes to think about these questions as they pertain to your own life. Excellent. So I think we will move on, but hopefully you've had a brief opportunity to reflect on your life. And when we've done this in practice, and we've done this in educational settings, in workplace settings, if we could go back to slide 9, please, and in medical settings, in communities in Columbus, Ohio. We will be doing this in Wuhan, China shortly. We've collected feedback from this, and we've gotten a variety of responses like some questions made me stop and think, or it was pretty eye-opening to see the areas that I really need to work on, or a sense of relief that someone is asking, I want help in certain areas. Some of the questions, especially around meaning and purpose, have prompted reflection. I was slightly caught off guard with the questions around purpose. I'm missing a greater purpose, need to reach out to help more and to give back. Personally, I find it helpful every so often to go through the questions myself and to identify what has been changing in my own life. And we've in fact been trying to do this at the national level also. And we have data now on what is happening during the COVID-19 pandemic with regard to nationwide flourishing. Unsurprisingly, flourishing on the whole has gone down, but what's very interesting is that it differs rather substantially across these different domains. So in the happiness and life satisfaction domain, the scores have gone down from about 7 to nearly a full point to 6.2, a pretty substantial decline. Likewise, in physical and mental health, nearly a full point. And the largest fall was with financial and material stability. Again, much a full point decline. And these are pretty substantial declines. It would be a move from the 50th percentile in the distribution down to the 37th percentile. But this is happening on average for everyone in the nation. So we do need to be concerned about these declines in various aspects of flourishing. But also interestingly, some of the other domains have been much less affected. The declines are much smaller for meaning and purpose, essentially unchanged for character assessments, and very little change as well for close social relationships. The variance of each of these has gone up during the pandemic, and so experiences are variable. For some with social relationships, for example, those who are socially isolated, this has been a difficult time. There have been real declines. But for others, it's allowed for investment in family or a housemate, and their well-being in the social domain has in fact gone up. So we can use this to try to study what is taking place as individuals, as communities, and as a country in terms of people's well-being. But we might then also wonder, well, okay, we can perhaps assess well-being, but what can we do to improve it? And that's what I will be spending the second half of this presentation on, ways in which we can enhance flourishing. And when Brittany from the Love and Fidelity Network asked me to speak, she wanted me to talk a little bit about what individuals can do. And so I'll spend a bit of time describing some of the activities for individuals that promote flourishing. But then I'll go on to talk about the importance of communities and of family. So this is, in fact, this question's been fairly well studied within the positive psychology literature for a number of years, and people have developed different interventions or activities that one can do on one's own to enhance well-being. And these have been assessed and studied in randomized trials, the same sorts of designs that are used to determine whether drug A or drug B is more effective. These same sorts of study designs have been used to study different ways that one can enhance one's own well-being. And one of the best studied of these activities is gratitude. A simple thing like 3 times a week, write down 3 things that you are grateful for and why, has been shown in randomized trials to increase levels of happiness, to relieve symptoms of depression, to improve sleep and self-reported health. And it's, again, something that one can easily do a few times a week. My wife and I try to do so over dinner with some frequency. And when we forget for a while, I do notice the difference. So this is, again, something very easy to do, but brings one's mind back to what in life is good. Another one of these easy-to-use activities or interventions concerns acts of kindness. And this has likewise been studied in randomized trials. And the idea here is to select one day each week for 6 weeks, say. Select one day and try to carry out 5 acts of kindness that you wouldn't otherwise ordinarily do. And carry this out for 6 weeks. It actually takes some effort if they're all going to be concentrated on the same day. It takes some effort in planning to think about how to carry this out. But likewise, participating in this activity versus something much more neutral has been found to have effects on improving one's happiness, for relieving symptoms of depression and achieving a greater engagement in life. Other interventions include kind of identifying one's central character strengths, and Penn's Center for Well-Being has a tool to do this. And then once a week, try to use each of your top 5 character strengths in a new way. Likewise, effects even 6 months later on happiness and on relieving depressive symptoms. So these things are very simple to implement. One can make it a part of one's daily life and practice. There are also various resources to address aspects of psychological distress. And in cases of severe anxiety or depression, professional counseling and care, I think, is very important. But for more mild symptoms, there have been workbooks that have been developed to address depression. David Burns' Feeling Good book is one of the best studied. Likewise, has been examined in multiple randomized trials and has found effects on alleviating depressive symptoms. I remember reading this as a graduate student and when I was going through a difficult time. And it was very helpful in my own life. Likewise, there's a similar book on mastering one's anxiety, and that's been found to have effects. There have been workbooks that have been developed to promote forgiveness. And these too have been studied in randomized trials to help people who are struggling to forgive, who want to forgive, but because of persistent anger, aren't able to do so. And we're in fact examining the efficacy of these workbooks now in 5 different countries, in Colombia, South Africa, Ukraine, Hong Kong, and in Indonesia, to see if they're effective cross-culturally as well. But these are simple, easy to use workbooks. They take about three hours, available on Everett Worthington's website. And these are the books we're trying to study to see if these too can be used to promote flourishing. And so these activities for flourishing, I think, can be helpful in promoting different aspects of well-being. But what's interesting is almost all of the effects are either for happiness or for health. And if we turn to the other flourishing domains, purpose, character, meaning, these interventions seem much less effective, and the positive psychology interventions that have been designed to try to improve purpose have generally been unsuccessful. And so I think for these other domains of human life, we need not just individual activities, but we need communities, we need relationships. And so that's what I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about now. And we've been trying to study at the Human Flourishing Program the pathways to promote not just happiness and health, but all of these various domains of flourishing. And we've been approaching this through a public health lens. And in my own discipline, which is public health, the way we assess the public health impact of a particular phenomena or exposure or intervention is through two ways. First, we think about how prevalent is the exposure or phenomena, how common is it? And second, how large are its effects on the outcomes that we care about? If something is very common and has large effects, then it's going to shape population health. So if we think about physical health through this lens, we end up with the important factors shaping physical health like exercise or nutrition or not smoking or sleep. But we could also apply this lens not just to physical health, but to all the domains of flourishing. We can ask, what are the pathways that are both common and have large effects on all of the domains of flourishing, on happiness, on health, on meaning, on character, on close relationships? And based on our literature review of the most rigorous studies, the studies that are using longitudinal data, I would propose 4 domains. We can go to the next slide now. And those 4 domains, or pathways rather, to promote flourishing are family, work, education, and religious community. There is strong evidence from the most rigorous empirical studies that each of these is relatively common in the population, both in the United States and worldwide, and each also has large effects on each of these different flourishing domains. The claim here is not that these are exhaustive, that these are the only pathways to promote flourishing, nor is the claim that they're necessary. One can flourish even in the absence of one or more of these pathways. But each does powerfully affect flourishing. And if individuals and policy efforts were made to try to enhance these pathways, to enable them, flourishing would increase. And so I want to talk a little bit more about how this relates specifically to families, and how families themselves and how marriage contributes to human flourishing. We can move on to the next slide now. So the vast majority of people everywhere do grow up in some sort of family context. And most, not all certainly, but most do go on to get married. Approximately 80% of Americans 25 or older will at some point get married. That data is a little bit old, and there's some indication that number may be declining in the future. But again, it's very, very common: participation in family life, participation in marriage. And marriage itself has been found to be associated in rigorous longitudinal studies, including in our own work, with happiness and life satisfaction. Strong evidence for physical and mental health that marriage contributes to longevity, both for men and for women. Some evidence for meaning and purpose, though this is not as well studied. Likewise for character. We just don't have very good measures in most of the existing studies, which we are at the Human Flourishing Program trying to change, but clear evidence that marriage typically leads to reductions in crime, for example, especially for at-risk populations. Clear effects on promoting greater social connection, lowering loneliness, promoting greater social support, and much better financial outcomes as well. Conversely, divorce is associated with poorer outcomes in each of these domains. These effects are even larger for those than with regard to marriage. And yet larger still are the effects of divorce on the lives of children. Strong evidence that in each of these domains, a divorce, the ending of a family life, has negative effects across these different human flourishing domains. So it is important, it is critical, both as individuals and as a society, to reflect upon how can we sustain and promote love and faithfulness within marriage. And so I want to talk a little bit more on the next slide about the efforts that can be made to promote family and marriage. I think one important approach is to eliminate marriage penalties in the welfare system. Some states have their welfare system structured so that if two people who are together get married, their welfare benefits go down, and this discourages them from becoming married. And this is problematic from a societal perspective, given all of marriage's benefits. So I think it's important that we remove these marriage penalties from the welfare system. I think another potentially promising approach to promote flourishing within marriage and within families is the use of early and online marital counseling. Marital counseling often takes place when a relationship is already in a great deal of trouble. Some people use it just to justify a divorce, but there's evidence, again, from randomized trials that certain forms of marital counseling, even online, early on, can be helpful in sustaining a marriage. Often people don't engage in this because it's expensive or they're embarrassed to seek help, but these online marital counseling programs might help address this and would be be possible to widely disseminate. I think another possible approach is to alter norms around entering marriage. Right now in the United States, it's often assumed that one will have a big, expensive wedding, and so marriage is often viewed as sort of something that happens after you've achieved a great deal of success in life or financially. I think if we could alter the norms around marriage and what a wedding ought to look like, that could likewise increase marriage taking place and not discouraging people who might otherwise marry. I think encouraging and studying positive parenting practices, family dinners, and styles of parenting that both exert a certain authority and control and discipline, but also, and importantly, are accompanied by love and caring and nurturing. So these are some of the things I think we can do at a societal level to promote family, to promote marriages, but of course there are also important individual practices. Faithful sexual practices very clearly promote flourishing. If we could still go back a slide, please. So evidence from rigorous studies that, for example, the number of sexual partners predicts poor subsequent relational communication, less sexual satisfaction long term, and greater rates of divorce, less marital stability. Infidelity, divorce, again, profoundly detract from flourishing. I think another way we can promote flourishing within families as individuals is by practicing forgiveness. And I think within the context of marriage or of any close relationship, there are always going to be wrongs, and we need to cultivate forgiveness, the replacing of ill will towards the offender with goodwill in all of our relationships, but in marriage as well. And so we've begun to try to study not just individual flourishing, but family level flourishing as well. To what extent are the relationships within a family good? To what extent is the parenting proficient? To what extent are there healthy practices in sustaining family life? To what extent do people find the experience of community within that family satisfying? And to what extent do families themselves have a strong mission? So that work is still in its very early stages, but we hope to study flourishing not just at the individual level, but at the family level as well. So we can go to the final slide now. So I talked a little bit about how families themselves and marriage is a powerful pathway, not the only pathway, not even a necessary pathway for a given individual, but at a societal level, a powerful pathway to promote individual flourishing. I've talked a little bit as well about how we can promote flourishing within families, both with regard to societal policies and efforts, but also with respect to actions individuals can take. But I would like to conclude this evening by talking a little bit about how family life itself should be conceived of as flourishing, not just a pathway to flourishing, but as flourishing itself. If we turn to the Jewish and Christian scriptures, we read in Genesis 1 in this account of the God's creating the heavens and the earth, that when in this narrative account, when God creates man and woman, he says, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it." So really, that notion of being fruitful, of having children, of multiplying, is embedded in these religious accounts of flourishing, really right from the beginning of these scriptures. And so I think as individuals and as a society, we need to come back to this notion that children themselves are a part of vision for flourishing. Of course, flourishing is dependent upon having life, and there is no way to have human life without children, without childbirth. And so really we should conceive of having children as itself flourishing. There really can be no future society. There can be no flourishing within society without children. And I think we need to come back to that vision, that children are not viewed as something, a distraction or something that detracts from one's well-being, but they are an integral part of one's well-being. I do think some of the reason there are these sort of modern hesitations over this idea are some of the studies looking at children and happiness. And there, the associations between the two are ambiguous, with some indication that parents, especially parents with young children, are less happy. And having two very young children myself, I can understand how this takes place sometimes. It does turn out that varies a lot across countries and depends in part on the systems in place to help support families and mothers and fathers in their parenting. But again, the relationship between children and happiness is somewhat complicated and ambiguous. But I think the effects of children on other aspects of flourishing, not just happiness, but on meaning, on the building of character, on the formation and the creation of relationships, are profound. And so I think when we take this flourishing lens and extend it beyond just happiness, we can see the profound contribution of children to our own flourishing and our own lives as well. I think parenting also involves sacrifice. Parenting involves giving up, in some aspects, one's own good for the good of others. But that is arguably part of what constitutes love. And thereby, in many religious traditions, and certainly my own, the Christian Catholic tradition, it is integral, the central part of true well-being and our final flourishing. So I think we need to reevaluate the role of children in our lives. We need to reevaluate metrics like GDP, and is this really the right way to think about flourishing? Because of that metric, I think the work of parents is often discounted, but really that work is what is enabling society to go on and to thrive. I think having children is one of the most profound forms of flourishing, and I really believe that little contributes more to societal flourishing than raising children well. And so I think we need to reshape our vision of the role of family, of the role of children in thinking about flourishing as individuals and as a society. I think family and marriage, love and fidelity, make profound contributions to human flourishing and are constitutive of human flourishing as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tyler. That was such a wonderful, profound talk. I'm always so grateful for your work. So now we are going to take some questions from our audience. And before we do that, I just want to remind everybody that you can drop your questions right now into the chat box on whatever platform you're using. So like if you're on Facebook, just use the comment section below the video. If you're on YouTube, just drop them into the chat box to the right of the stream. If you're using YouTube on your phone, it's under the video. So I've got a question picked out for Tyler, but I just want to note that there's still plenty of time for you to get yours in. So yeah, just take a minute to get your questions into the chat. And remember that if you're on Facebook, you can hit the like button to like the LFN page. And if you're on YouTube, you can ring the bell and subscribe to LFN. Okay, so for the first question, which is from Sarah, do you think a life of leisure is something we should aspire to? Are leisure-filled people flourishing people?
I think that is a very, very good question, and I tend to think about the role of leisure in flourishing in two ways. One of which is that I do think some degree of leisure is necessary to pursue different pathways or forms of flourishing. I think some degree of freedom, of time available is needed to adequately engage in relationships, to pursue one's own learning and understanding, to have time free to help those in need, to develop greater virtue. So I think leisure, I think time that is free, that is available, is essential to pursuing these various other forms or pathways towards flourishing. But I also think there's a sense in which leisure is constitutive of flourishing also. Once again, from my own tradition, Catholic tradition, I think being present with and silent before and contemplating God, it is in fact the highest and the final form of flourishing. And for that, leisure is not simply necessary, but it is part of flourishing itself in that regard.
Right, so it's not just watching TV. You'll get no argument from me there. So you were talking earlier about sacrifice and suffering and parenthood and how that can be a part of human flourishing. And I guess that just makes me want to ask you, what does it feel like if you're flourishing? You know, if you're quarantined with your kids and things are really rough, but you know that it's good for you. I mean, what should we think about the subjective side of human flourishing, especially when, you know, things are a little bit rough?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a difficult question, and one that many people are struggling with today. I mean, as you've seen from the statistics in many of these domains, the well-being or flourishing has indeed gone down. And I do think it's important to recognize those losses and to acknowledge them as real losses. I do think sacrifice is always giving up some good for sacrifice, giving up some good for a higher good. And so I think when we are in the midst of suffering, it's important to acknowledge that loss, but then to reflect on and think about what good might come of it. How might I myself grow in character? How can I seek to do good, even when I myself am struggling or am unhappy? And I think that sort of approach and that way of thinking about suffering is universally applicable. But I do think suffering is one of those topics where there's a great deal of disagreement across how to view this as part of flourishing in the different religious traditions. And I think it's important to acknowledge those differences. I think, again, from my own standpoint, from my own tradition, I think suffering is in fact necessary to achieve that final flourishing with God, and that helps me through these times of difficulty, of suffering. But again, I think it's always also important to acknowledge the real losses that are present, not to ignore them, and as best we can to figure out how to address them as well.
Wow, as you might imagine, I totally agree with that. Well, anyway, thank you again for your wonderful talk. really just full of insights. So we're going to begin with the next presentation. So we'll see everybody back here in a minute.